Good evening, everyone. So welcome to the Architecture at the Edge discussion, COVID-19, or public space, sorry, the antidote to COVID-19. So here with us today, we have JP McMahon and Amy McKeown. JP McMahon, to those of us in Galway, we know him well, is a chef and restaurateur and author and culinary director of EatGalway Restaurant. He runs Aniar Boutique Cookery School and has done a lot for Galway in terms of raising the educational, ethical and interactive aspects of food. And then we have Amy McKeown as well, who's founder and director of Fjord Studios. She's a registered architect with the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland and founder also of Design POP, a design, architecture and food festival in Cork. So as we all know, COVID-19 has resulted in pretty much unprecedented restrictions in how we have been using and engaging with public space worldwide, with populations throughout the world asked to stay at home or restrict movements in public space, and this having a whole host of repercussions throughout society and the economy. So cities like Galway or Cork that are, well known for their hustle and bustle and active street life, they've been transformed in the context of COVID. And so we're going to have a chance in this discussion to talk about these aspects of public space in terms of their use, the way we perceive it, and how it can be redesigned perhaps in the context of the interruptions that COVID has brought. So I'm going to hand over to our two panelists now and ask you to introduce yourself. So we'll start with Amy McKeown. Can you please introduce yourself and tell the audience who you are?
Sure, my name is Amy McKeown. I founded Fjord Studios 2 years ago. At the same time, Fjord Studios is an architecture and multidisciplinary design practice. So we base a lot of our work with architecture and interior design work, but we also work a lot with collaborators. So that kind of was the genesis of this idea that I had, which was an architecture and food design festival based in Cork, which is called Design POP, which had its first year in May 2019. And then we were trying to go again in May 2020, but obviously, everything happened. So then we moved it to the end of August this year. But unfortunately, COVID struck again and the restrictions kicked in, so we had to cancel it. But so my general day job is an architect. I work at that pretty much full time, and then the kind of passion project is Design POP. So it's this festival that has pavilions all around the city. We had 6 in our first year. So the pavilions were designed by architects in collaboration with a local food producer. And we set the architects and designers the challenge to create a structure or a pavilion in a certain context, a unique context around the city, and then to capture the ethos and the kind of the essence of the food producer that was going to be housed within it for the weekend. So it was a phenomenal kind of explosion of design, creativity and food in Cork, and it created this beautiful design and food trail all around the city, and it was kind of a new way or a new lens in which to see the city through. And then we had this kind of hub up on Curtin Street where we had loads of talks, demonstrations, panel discussions. So that's kind of my two jobs are those two things.
Okay, thanks, Amy. And so we'll see that there's lots of intersections there between the use of public space and food, so we can come back to that later. And JP, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, as you said, I'm a chef and a restaurateur. We have 3 restaurants in Galway, one of which is closed at the moment because of COVID. It's a Michelin-starred restaurant. It depends a lot on tourism. Sometimes 70 or 80% of our guests are American. So we decided not to reopen it. We were due to reopen in March, but unfortunately, by the time June, July came along, our season would end in Aniar in October, and it was kind of like only opening for 12 to 14 weeks just didn't seem viable. And also then to try to put our resources into the other 2. As well as that, I run a symposium called Food on the Edge, which we also cancelled this year. This was to be its 6th year, and it's an annual gathering of about 50 chefs and industry professionals to an audience of about 600. So that takes place in Galway. It's taken place in NUIG for the last 2 years, in the Black Box and the Town Hall in previous years. And the first year we had it in a tent in Ayr Square. So, and most of the questions there would be about the future of food, sustainable practice, and I suppose the ecology, a lot of different things that we're interested as a restaurant. And then the last string to my bow is that I'm also doing a PhD in drama. So it's my PhD is on food and drama, and it's a practice-based PhD. So I write plays as well. So I put a play on last year in the Dublin Fringe Festival called Irish Food, and we set it in a restaurant. And so my research looks at how when you change the setting for food out of a restaurant and into a theatre, what happens, like in terms of how it affects people, and also the ethics of food in a restaurant. I suppose specifically around when you my example is when you kill a lobster in a restaurant for food, someone eats it, and there was very little drama in the sense of people feeling sorry for the lobster. But when you kill a lobster on stage, if they will allow you to kill a lobster on stage, that is, there was a lot of ethical implications. There was a lot of consent issues, and a lot of these things just came out of the research. So that's, I mean, I suppose as Amy, I'm very interested in how, I suppose, disciplines cross over and how we can learn from different disciplines. And I suppose as Food on the Edge has grown, we have started to invite speakers from different fields to try and I suppose cut into the food narrative, because sometimes when you put a bunch of chefs together, you get a very homogenous narrative. But sometimes when you put in you put in a farmer, you put in a designer, whatever you do, you start to change up the mix and the collaborations that kind of ensue from that.
Great. Thanks, JP. So lots of different, I didn't know you were doing a PhD looking at the intersections of drama and food. So that's really interesting. And then taking up on that, the change of food contexts, I guess. So the next question I had for you guys was what are the key issues from your perspective you see concerning the impact of COVID-19 and the use of public space on your own sector or your own work? So I guess for this one, we could start with JP. So what are the key challenges you've witnessed for in terms of being in Galway, around food, around use of public space?
I think the first one was the lack of people. I think, and with the lockdown, which we closed all 3 restaurants, I think that was probably one of the beginning, or one of the key issues at the start. I think emerging from lockdown, the challenges were having socially distant dining, creating like contact tracing, and adding that into your daily mix of what you needed your staff to do. Also the staff, to a certain degree, policing who can come into the restaurant, who cannot come into the restaurant. So particularly at the very beginning, when the airports were open, there was no green lists. We had a lot of different people still coming to Ireland, and then there was a kind of an ambiguous element in relation to did they have to quarantine? When I suppose if they came to your door, have you the right to refuse them X, Y, and Z? I think probably going into the next stage, which is I suppose even though it's probably just the second wave of COVID, it feels like the third stage of trying to run a restaurant, in the sense that we were closed, we did a takeaway model, we reopened, we had a limited model on the tables. But going forward now, it's like, how do we sustain ourselves over the next 6 months with being 30% down as a lot of the funding gets cut off. So the funding is gradually getting cut off. In lockdown, it was I suppose it was like a honeymoon. The government were giving us money, covering most bases, not the rent, but covering most bases. So, and now it's becoming more and more difficult. And so I think there's a kind of there's an element of survival of the fittest. I think that's what I feel like in the industry, the kind of Darwinian model, in the sense that it is now we're being pitched against each other, and some will survive and some won't. And I think that is a strategy that the government is pursuing by kind of slowly cutting funding off, because some won't. And I would look abroad quite a lot, and if you look at the example of Copenhagen, they came out of lockdown 2 months before us. They opened at the start of May, and I'm seeing a lot of restaurant closures in Copenhagen now, like high profile ones. And I think that I expect to see that in November in Cork, Dublin, and Galway, because the books don't add up. So I mean, they're the key issues. And on the issue of public space and Ireland, I think some cities have done it better than others. I think Cork have done it quite well, and Amy will speak for that. I think in Galway we've been quite lackadaisical about it. We put up certain areas that we assumed that people would just sit in, but very little kind of coordinated thinking. Just put up bollards, and there's a little bit more coming now. But sometimes I think that Galway as a tourist town resides on its reputation, and we're very unwilling to be proactive sometimes. I think at the level of planning a city in some sort of holistic way. It seems to be like it's just all little fragments stuck together, and I see that again and again and again. And sometimes I think that we do need something far more radical if Galway is going to come out of a post-COVID space and make the city better in terms of its walking around, cycling, space for people to sit outside, because it's just that you can't just sit outside in Ireland. You need to sit outside with barriers or heaters, and there's a lot to do. That's planning. There's planning applications. There's costs. It's not just as simple as sticking chairs outside, which is what I think they assumed would happen by just kind of taking away car spaces. So there needs to be a lot more thinking, and I don't know. Like, the skeptic in me would feel that I don't know if we have the strength to do it at the level of the local government. I just don't know if the will is there. But yeah. I suppose the difficulty I see at the moment.
Yeah, interesting, because we saw recent attempts, for example, to install pop-up cycling lanes coming up against governance blocks along the way, and it seems to really be there's a governance issue there around the implementation of new plans for designing the cities. If you look at any of the kind of documents, they have some ideas in there, but they're not being translated into actual action, or they're not being implemented. So there's some kind of gap coming, or some kind of issues coming with regards to implementation. So would you say that the business community in Galway feel heard around their new needs for public space?
No, I suppose I don't think so. I mean, I think there's very little dialogue. I mean, there is the beginnings of dialogue now, but I suppose like Amy as an architect will probably know more about it than I. But I would assume, and again I could be wrong, I would assume Galway has a city planner. I could be wrong. But I think what happens is, I really think that the job of a city planner should be separate from the council, in the sense of, I think what happens is city planners say X, Y, and Z, and then that goes to the council and it's contested, and you have wide relationships. And then, unfortunately, being in Galway 20 years, very little has changed in terms of the traffic. But it's not for want of plans, and it's not for want of people growing up. Simon Heaslip from the Blue Nut Rushing Around the Corner has done up a one-way system on Dominic Street, but it constantly just comes up against opposition. Yeah. So I really think that the job of the city planner needs to be separate from the local politics, and that job needs to be aligned with environmental issues, with ecological issues, with public space issues, as opposed to whose road is this, who has access to it. Is this going to upset someone? Are there residents that need this parking space, or can we just take it? And because if you follow that script, you never get anywhere. And you can see that in many streets in Galway. And like Frank and all this as well, that it's just constant, a constant battle to try and change anything.
Yeah, the real battle is in implementation. So the visions are there, but it's not being implemented. So Amy, would you like to take up there on, from your perspective as an architecture, around the challenges that you've seen in the context of COVID in relation to the use of public space?
Sure. So for me personally, it was very much a two sides of the same coin. I had, the architecture business was pretty undisturbed by COVID. Okay, sites stopped, but we kept on going. And then to have one element of my business kind of relatively untouched, to then go to Design Pop, which was completely like screeched to a halt. Planning stopped because it was due in May. And then come March, everything happened, and then for it to change again. But I think the challenges in public space, I think Cork City Council did respond quite well, and they actively engaged the restaurateurs. The streets like Prince's Street were kind of tested quite quickly. They engaged with the restaurants who kind of faced onto it, asked them to take a section and kind of ownership over it. And then they kind of put out the seats, and it became this really vibrant space, and people were sitting in the public realm, whether it was raining or not, with umbrellas having their coffee. So they responded quite quickly, and then once they saw the success of this, they rolled it out quite profusely in a few other streets. Then again, I think the challenges are that people, the city councils will just presume, like you said, that once they put seats out, that the people will come, but there needs that interaction, that energy needs to be there for the people to actively engage with the public realm. And I think there's such an opportunity with COVID, through collaboration with different disciplines, and really engaging with the public. You can create these amazing spaces in which people can enjoy culture, food, the atmosphere of a city from outdoors, which would be, it's obviously safer than enjoying it from inside the restaurant, and it can kind of keep things going and keep things engaged. And one thing that maybe, Galway City Council could look to Cork City Council, not that I'm singing their praises too much, but they've introduced, or they've kind of established this initiative where they've done this big call out to architects and creatives and designers to create these parklets that they've trialed before. So it's an outdoor seating structure that they've got a creative person to partner with the restaurant, and in a parking space create this beautiful place for the restaurant to serve into and for the public to engage with and have all year round. And they issued one quite successfully on Douglas Street, and on the back of that success have now created this initiative to create 10 more. So I think there's a lot of kind of energy in Cork City Council with the food industry, because they just, it's what Cork people love, and it's certainly something that I've leveraged with Design Pop, the kind of the great interaction of the public with food in Cork. So I think there can be a lot learned from Cork City Council to Galway City Council in that regard.
Yeah, very good. So yeah, you raise an interesting point there around how, social relationships happen in public space, and when public space and its use is changed, the social relationships within that place change. So going forward then, to what you think are the key issues, I think, that are how COVID can be seen as a critical moment in regards to rethinking, and not only how we're using public space, but also how we might think about redesigning it, like you said there, Amy. So I wanted to pose a question to both of you to reflect on those two elements. So the uses and perceptions of public space, but also the design of it. And from your perspective in your respective disciplines, where you see Ireland going in that regard?
In my opinion, I think COVID, obviously it's a terrible situation to be in, but I do think in a sense it focuses us locally. And I think it's a way, because we're not allowed to go anywhere. If you're in Dublin, you're not supposed to travel. It becomes more city centric and much more of your peripheral. So there is an opportunity there for us to refocus about shopping local, so food producers, local food supplies, and enhancing that, and really celebrating the incredible produce we have around us, and as well in food, as well as designers and architects. I think there is a real unlocking yet to be had with collaborations, and I think through architects collaborating with different disciplines, like I'm trying to do with Design Pop, I think you get a phenomenal and very fruitful kind of journey and experience and design process, and people are really learning and collaborating together, creating these structures that are put into the kind of public realm. And it gives the public this kind of new way of seeing their city, that when you put these kind of pavilions or structures in a space where someone's walked past it every day of their lives, or different spaces that they haven't seen before, and it brings them to a new part of their city or a new part of their vicinity, I think there's a real unlocking and a potential there that I would hope the city councils and the people making the decisions can really see the real energy and potential that's there.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think for all of us, we've re-engaged with our local space and our local vicinity in new ways, out of pure necessity, like the 2 kilometre restriction, and then the 5 kilometre restriction, and then 20 kilometres. So I think it's provided a context in which we've had to familiarise ourselves with our own local urban or public spaces, and the question of equity is key there, I think, as well, in terms of the type of living arrangements you have, what kind of access to space you have at home, and the role of public space then in accounting for perhaps some kind of inequities in terms of the degree to which people have ample space at home, for example, as well, and different parts of the city. So maybe we can touch base on the question of equity and use of public space in a minute. But before that, I wanted to go over to you, JP, and ask what you see then going forward, what you'd like to see as key developments out of this in terms of how public space is perceived and used, and not discounting the governance issues we face perhaps in Galway, but in a dream world, I guess, what you'd like to see.
I think what I've noticed, and I suppose it's not in the field of public space, but I think it's applicable, is that there's things that we have accepted because of COVID that we wouldn't have accepted before. So, for example, we're doing online cooking classes with people from the States, and I think even to suggest that in the past, to do a 3-hour class via Zoom would not have been a runner. Like, we're almost paperless in Tartare because we had to get rid of our menus. We started using QR codes. Things are going online, and all of a sudden, things that people could not accept, now they just do. And I think that if we take that kind of logic, that's my dog, if you take that logic and apply it to public space, then we should be able to do more. And I think what the resistance, or the element of resistance for me, is that when you put things into the public domain, they take longer to enact. And perhaps, like, I think it's disappointing that, say, some of the pop-up cycleways are now gone. They were there and then they've just disappeared. And I do think that our acceptance of, like, say, okay, we're in the city, there has to be loads of cars. I do think now the fact that we've pedestrianised some streets, I would like to see that moving forward and saying, well, how much of the city centre can we pedestrianise? Like, do we really need traffic in there 24/7? Can we, like, say, Shop Street and Cross Street, limit traffic to 9 to 11 and then have them as pedestrian spaces? Like, so for me in Galway, I would like to see the effect of COVID in terms of how it affects public space, like, translate into the eventual pedestrianisation of the whole city centre, like I'm talking about the medieval core, because I don't think you need traffic there continually. And I think that will increase the level of the quality of life in around there. I think it will bring down the pollution in the city centre, and I think that it will make that space more habitable. And I think wherever they have done this in in any of the cities in England that were all of a sudden they built a motorway and there was nothing passing through the city anymore. They have shown that kind of greening the city in some way, and there has been a slight greening of Galway where in spaces where they put up they took away car spaces, they put up like sort of plant boxes and more natural elements. I would like to see more of that, because often in the city there's an absolute lack of a natural environment. It's a very urban space, and I think we need more of a dialogue, or more of a working towards, like, how do you make a city centre more, how do we green it more, you know, and there are plenty of examples around the world and in Europe. And I think sometimes I feel, even though we are in the EU, we're the last to adopt kind of EU policy. And I think even at the moment when, like, I think that most countries in the EU are working towards sitting spaces outside restaurants, we're still very, very slow in Ireland, even though we might say, okay, it's the weather, but I mean, the weather in Copenhagen isn't that much better, or the weather in Sweden isn't that much better, and they're already moving a lot quicker than we are. And particularly in relation, if you think of Denmark and their vast network of cycleways. And I think that it's a missed opportunity, because if we do this gradually, then we can get more change. Like, there's never going to be a light switch moment where every place turns into a cycleway. Like, if we don't do it in a small way, it'll never happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, we have a comment here, you know, saying again that, you know, Galway City Council does have planners, but the councillors lack ambition and vision. And I guess from your perspective, Amy, what would be the difference with regards to what's happening down in Cork in terms of a change actually happening? Because I think that's kind of crucial for Galway to learn from.
Before I comment on Cork, I did do kind of a bit of research about Galway before I came here, and from my notes, Allies and Morrison, a big architectural practice in the UK, have already done this Galway public realm strategy, and it won an award in the Irish Planners Institute. So I think the thinking was probably there, and execution, according to JP, is probably not there. So I think, you know, that kind of that follow through needs to happen. When also having a kind of a London-based or a UK-based architecture practice working on it, I think there was another local landscape architect, but it's that kind of like, it needs to come from this, you know, Galway core to drive this, because, you know, this peripheral or this UK company coming in and saying this is what you need to do, like they're obviously incredibly good at their job, they're a fantastic firm, but that kind of essence and that drive from the local architects, and there's such a pool of incredible creatives in Galway. I think harnessing that, you know, Galway City Council would really harness that, you know, and follow through, and that energy would be there. Because to compare it to Cork, I think what we have is a couple of people, one guy in particular who is a champion of design pop, and a real guy who gets things done is Paul McGurk. He was in the Cork City Council, and now he's the head of the local enterprise office. It
So
only
certain
takes
people.
one person, and I think certain people, and he's really, really pushed placemaking. He's found funding to get kind of graffiti artists and seating, and he has just, you know, relentlessly gone out creating these spaces, which became so important when COVID did hit, because all these times, you know, you could get a takeaway sandwich, but like, where are you to go? Because you can't sit in, you had to go somewhere, and that kind of going somewhere needed to happen way before before COVID hit. And I think we were lucky to have him, who still is championing these kind of placemaking things. But I think it only takes a few. But I think it needs to come from within, you know, either someone pushing the council or vice versa. Because I think, in my opinion, getting Allies and Morrison to do this massive strategic public realm plan, you know, there's just a lack of context and knowing the space.
I think as well, I do think that it's down to having people in the council, and I think often, or even in the government, because I think it trickles down, and I often see it in food as well, that like there is very few people in the government in terms of ministers and TDs that will that will back food as a cultural experience. I mean, we're very quick to back sport as a cultural experience, but to back food as a cultural experience and then to say this is really, really important. Like if we don't have that passing through the different governments, then it's always going to be down to private enterprise, and then private enterprise and entrepreneurship banging against the local and the national government. And I do think at times we have had people in the council, but unfortunately what happens is once you lose that person, then you're kind of like you begin all over again. And I think that's why I would say, like, if you do have a city planner and we have a city manager, I mean, really some decisions have to be made separate to the local council. And whether that's about looking at environmental policy or climate change and saying this is what we have to do, and we're going to have to do it even if these councillors don't want to do it because they're looking for votes and there's vested interest. If it's always going to be about votes and vested interest, we can't move forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think we have a comment here. What is stopping Galway? Like Amy says, the public realm strategy is there. So I think we're establishing that it really needs to happen from inside the council, but also that the push is there from the public, it seems, but that it's not actually happening. And the vision, in fact, is even there, but it's not being implemented. And one way in which that can be, helped is by establishing a team that kind of will persist despite, for example, one or two people maybe leaving, and that team being relatively independent as well in terms of implementation. So a nice interdisciplinary team with architects, sociologists, restaurateurs.
Because even if you think about like the 2018 in Galway with the regional gastronomy, like I don't think there was enough legacy projects put in place to see stuff go beyond that year. And while it's great to have that designation, and unfortunately, like Galway was European Capital of Culture this year, there needs to be more legacy projects in a very practical way, as opposed to it's great to put stuff on in the year and see the event, but I think, as you said, there needs to be some mixed committee between the public and the private realms where we can meet and discuss and say, look, this is what's best for the city. Because if it is going to be just fragmented areas, like things are never going to move forward.
Yeah, great. And another comment here then, thinking about best practice, are there European models that are working from Phaidon?
Well, I would always my dream city, and even though it has a lot of problems when you talk to is Copenhagen, and I go there not only in terms of food but in terms of its use of public space. Like you can cycle 40 kilometers outside Copenhagen on a bicycle, and your bicycle way never runs out. It doesn't disappear. Whereas if you cycle in Galway, you get about a kilometer of bicycle way, and then it just disappears, it evaporates. In the same way, some of the paths, I think, and this demonstrates why the city is just built for cars, is that some of the paths just disappear as well. And so I think they're a little kind of, for me, these are stress points. And we need to look at these and say, like, can we change this one thing? Or can we change, our practice of building roads? And if we can only just put in cycleways every so often, then we're never going to have people cycling all the time.
Yeah. So there needs to be an overall strategic vision for how it plays out, but it also needs to be data driven from the experiences on the ground, I think. I was at a very interesting talk here by the Fietsbond, which is the Netherlands kind of cycling authority, and they talked about how they emerged to be the way they are today, and it wasn't always this way. In the 70s they were following the same car-centric model, for example, as the rest of Europe. There were huge protests by citizens here and demonstrations and everything, and instead they decided to listen to the citizens and to slowly and quietly build a this huge interconnected network of intercity bike highways and everything, so you can actually travel the whole country on a bike lane here. So it's interesting to see how that plays out, and the different governing strategies that can support it, the realization of these visions, I guess. And then for you, Amy, do you think then there are stronger crossovers and dialogues then between sectors such as hospitality, arts and culture in Cork?
Well,
From Phaidon again.
Bring it to Galway for a bit. I do think initiatives like exactly what we're in now, Architecture at the Edge, when there's pavilions in the city centre, and pavilions and structures, and Galway Arts Festival do a fantastic job as well. I saw the Mirror Pavilion show the importance of these kind of moments within the city by putting something into it that's magnificent for a time, and it's there and it generates interest in that space and something's new there, and then it's taken away. I think those moments, when they persist and keep going and create that legacy of their public realm areas, are places for things to happen, and there's that kind of potential there. And I think things like Architecture at the Edge and Food on the Edge, all of them showcase these consistently, and I think the public do engage with them. It takes a while, for people to gain interest, but I think food is certainly an incredible tool of engagement. As soon as there's kind of the food element there, people are in, whatever it is, they're engaged with. And I do think design and architecture can sometimes be perceived as isolating in a sense. And when you kind of have the collaboration between the two, it becomes this kind of, I don't know, kind of magnified interaction piece. So I think, yes, there needs to be more conversations with kind of stakeholders in the kind of businesses in a city. But I think what you're doing now, what people are doing, is really kind of highlighting the importance of public realm.
Yes, so not just creating these kind of more formal kind of forms of dialogue or engagement, but to allow it to happen organically by creating these events in public space that bring these actors and stakeholders together, or that engage people creatively in new ways. So that's really interesting. So are there any we'd like to open it up more to the floor here now. So anyone from the audience would like to speak up, you're welcome to turn on your microphone if you would, or to use the comment box. But please feel free to participate as you wish. If there's no further questions, I'll pose another one. Oh, here's Simon here. What is your response to the youth that are out in the street in droves the last few days? Do you think there is a design solution that could tackle this behavior?
Oh, I don't know. That's a very difficult proposition. I do think that it's a very difficult time, and I think that it's hard because I think the space that we're negotiating is very fragmented, and I think that you don't have buy-in on all parties. And when you mix COVID up with international politics and fake news and different narratives, like, the problem is you don't have buy-in all around, and particularly with young people who I suppose are affected less. Then there's less buy-in. So it is difficult. And I think I was actually thinking about when before the pubs opened and the cafes had opened in Dublin, there was a lot of places that had no public toilets. And that's something that we completely overlook in Ireland. Like, we don't even think about the fact that there is no public toilets, or there's very, very few, because most people can just pop into a pub or a restaurant. But all of a sudden, if your places are only doing takeaway and you can't go into them, then it's more difficult. And there are no spaces where people can congregate en masse at the moment, or even in isolated ways. So I think it's a very hard one to answer. I mean, I think that for me, there's a tension between what we want as what we want to get out of COVID, which is reducing the cases, but then also what we want to try and keep the economy going. And for me, there's a kind of tension between seeing the restaurant and the pub as a negative space that isn't safe, and this narrative is ongoing. But at the same time, we have institutions like supermarkets and off licenses that can sell alcohol, that can bring a lot of people together. Because at the end of the day, the issue is alcohol. I mean, that's not just in Ireland, that is European wide. I mean, when they opened the nightclubs in Spain, they had an absolute spike. And so, well, perhaps that's probably one of the greatest things that we have to learn as a people is how we negotiate alcohol in the public space. Because unfortunately, once you bring that in, social distancing generally doesn't happen as much. And so that's probably one of the greatest questions that we all need to answer.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes,
I would agree in a sense. Like the students are young, they're social creatures, they're tasting freedom for the first time. You know, having public space, like we saw in Galway, and I think there's an issue in Cork as well. They're going to congregate. Is there a design solution? It's probably way more complex than that. It's about, I mean, they've heard the rhetoric. You know, everyone's been telling them to socially distance. However, I think the urge to socialize became far too great, and I think they've had a tough summer. I'm not, you know, I don't condone what they were doing, but I do sympathise. A design solution, probably not one that we're going to come up with right now. It's really complex.
Yeah, it's probably higher up, and I think the difficulty with that is that I think a lot of the decisions that are being made that affect the public realm are being made very last minute. And even, for example, like this week, I expected a lockdown in Galway on Thursday, so the city, I could feel, was closing down, and the bookings were less, people were cancelling less and less and less and less, and then it didn't happen. So now there's a kind of relief, and people kind of breathe again and go back out. And unfortunately, you have this push and pull thing in the sense that on Friday, all the students were told college is Monday previous college is happening, everything's normal. Then Friday, it's like, no, everything's online. Like, while it is very, very difficult and the government need to plan, I think that they need to pick something and then go with it for a month and keep that. Because otherwise, I feel at the moment that, like, if we don't know if there's going to be a lockdown next week, and then we just plan for next week, and then we plan for one more week, and you keep on planning by the week, but that doesn't create any stability. And even if you were saying, for example, oh, we're going to put outside furniture, we're going to put awnings, like, to even plan that much ahead when we don't know if we can do it. Like, we need some sort of stability over a 6-week period or a 12-week period. And unfortunately, there'll have to be compromises. And I think that's why, for me, there needs to be more transparency and accountability from NEPID on some of the decisions they're making, because I feel we're very far from Europe at the moment. We're very far from a kind of any sort of dialogue, and we're making decisions based on practice that there isn't evidence for, in terms of when NEPID say that this is based on international practice, but that international practice isn't forthcoming. So I mean, it is difficult. And we live in a global world, and technology we can see anywhere in the world at the moment. So I think there has to be way more transparency.
Yeah, so I think it's all in relation. So if we think about COVID, public space is the antidote to COVID-19. So people need to socially interact, especially at certain ages and phases of life, as you say, Amy, transitional periods. But if indoor space is being confined and constricted, you know, we need to think about how we can enable young people to use public space in a safe way. So I think the fact that it's been so restricted in Ireland relative to, for example, here in the Netherlands, even though the situation here is not good, the cases are rising a lot, but there's been a lot more freedom for people to kind of follow the rules in the ways they see fit, I think, and that's involved allowing people into pubs earlier so that they don't have this huge congregation element when they have the final chance, you know. So I think there's a question here: do you think COVID will force city councils to adopt more European attitudes then to things like drinking in public streets?
I hope so, but I mean, if you think back of was it in the late 90s when the cafe licensing laws, they tried to bring that in, I think it was Michael Mathul, and that was put down by the pubs. And like, I do think that we need some brave decisions. And the fact that, like, even for example, you can buy a beer in McDonald's in France, but you can, like, you're severely restricted in Ireland to places. I do think we need a kind of opening up, because if we open up the spaces, then there will be less congregations in focused areas. And I think that's probably one of the issues with the pubs, as like the pubs play a central role in Ireland, and that's why we have such difficulty opening them up.
And you saw like Monroe's there catching on very early, selling the pints to people outside. And do you think there'd be room for that for more street food, for example, in Galway?
I'd love to see that. And again, it needs to come on both sides. I think that the businesses need to propose ideas, but they also need to be accepted and to be followed through on. And if for example, as Amy was saying, if you buy a roll and there's nowhere to sit down, there's nowhere to go. I mean, like, there has to be kind of joined up thinking, because at the moment it's someone opens a restaurant and then all of a sudden an area becomes associated with restaurants and then something happens. Whereas I'd much prefer to see, like, for me, like looking at some models in New York, sometimes when they build apartment complexes, they build restaurants into them, as opposed to building an apartment complex and then thinking, oh yeah, we need a restaurant, and oh yes, there's the park. And sometimes we don't have that joined up thinking, and then all of a sudden you just have an apartment block with nothing, and then there's the issues with the resources and that. And so I think we do need more holistic projects where when we design spaces, that we're making sure that the environment is protected, but also then that there's room for public space to maneuver. And I'd love to see wider streets. I mean, the irony with all the social distancing in Ireland with 2 meters, I mean, the average path is 3 foot wide, and then you have to walk the road, and then cars are there, and then they're telling people on the radio, drivers, please appreciate that people walking on the road, and then you cyclists. And so there's very little room to maneuver. And like, there needs to be some kind of expansive thinking if we are going to have wider paths and less cars. And I think that is the way forward. I mean, public transport is an ongoing kind of thing, and we need more of that, because if that isn't there, then there will always be private cars.
Yeah, absolutely. And how a better, I think, quicker kind of dialogue between those who are using the spaces on the ground and then those who have the power to actually install and change things like installing new park benches or areas where people can sit and eat food and so on. So at the moment it just takes too long, if it can happen at all. So I think I don't have any more questions yet from the audience here. So I guess, in terms of that question around equity and exclusion. So one thing that's interested me is the way in which, the COVID-19 situation has kind of highlighted maybe some already existing exclusions or inclusions in public space. So I thought it would be interesting to hear your perspective, Amy and JP, on what kind of inequalities have been revealed, and how you think the needs of, for example, those who have maybe less access to public space, how they might be accounted for in the future.
Well, to kind of go back to the point that JP was saying about kind of pedestrianising the spaces and getting kind of, food as, onto the street, so it's kind of a tool of engagement. I think city councils could really begin to push that even further. I think they could think about the weather and design and create structures or temporary structures that kind of address that. And then, yes, bring food onto the street, but also bring cultural things. So get galleries interested and invested in kind of maybe showcasing things outdoors, because outdoors is inherently safer than being indoors at this time. So let's embrace the weather, but let's embrace all aspects of culture and all these kind of institutions that we have on offer. So it could be things, having young exhibitions, having creatives, and displaying things, draw people outside and give the youth or everyone a space to engage with something that's engaging, cultural, and giving them that kind of place and realm in which to experiment and to create these kind of more culturally adaptive elements, which then inherently give hopefully the younger people another thing to engage with. So hopefully they might go with their friends to see some, exhibition on the street and then grab some food and then have a drink. So it becomes much more of a realm of kind of inclusion and activity. So, and then to go on to the point of the people who are inclusion and exclusion. I think
so thinking like older people, people with underlying illnesses, these people who've been kind of excluded and maybe quite frightened now, and they see like hordes of young people and so on the streets.
I think also you have the issue, and this is probably a European-wide issue, is that COVID generally spreads more in poorer communities and communities that have less space. Even if you look at the meat plant workers, they share rooms, they share beds. Like, so there is an element of inequality when it comes to people who live in large suburban houses that can have space to people who share apartments, or people who share with 6 people they don't know. And how do you feel safe in that space? I think one interesting thing about the acceleration of thinking about space and public space is that like at the moment, you don't have to apply for planning in Galway to put awnings out, and you don't have to pay for outside chairs. And so for me, the interesting point is that, like, that for some reason that wasn't possible last year, it wasn't possible the year before, but now all of a sudden with COVID, it's possible. So I think a lot of things that we say that are not possible, really, it's just that we don't want to do them. And I think the health system is a good example of the amount of money that went into the health system this year was probably not thought possible in the past. So I would like to see more creative thinking in terms of, well, if we can allow places to put awnings out without having to go through too many hoops, perhaps then we will have more outside spaces and we will have more freedom to negotiate. Whereas at the moment, or in the past, there was a lot of things in your way and a lot of opposition to it. So I do think I'd like to see that going forward, possibly adapted in the city.
Great. Yeah, really. Yeah. So you mentioned a good point there about the need for kind of new forms of creative thinking. So just before we close, going back to then this idea of design solutions and the different ways of thinking that different design approaches put forward, the different strategies that might be needed. So if we've said that we need more inclusive design, we need a better ways of creating dialogue between different stakeholders to create a vision, but not only create that vision, but actually implement the vision. So if there's anything you want to add as a final point there in terms of new ways of thinking for designing public space at the end, that would be great.
I suppose as a final point, in any city, I think there is such potential with, like we were saying, we discussed it through collaboration, and I think if people just kind of open their minds and we're happy to engage with the public and to really ask, like, effectively even the youth, like what they want, and to really have that kind of level of engagement, have the gusto and the commitment to do even small gestures and watch those build, because the more you do, the more you'll get back from the public and everyone. So I think there's such creativity and such potential to be unlocked in cities, and finding new ways to use our city and to see it and to view it. I think there's such a local resource there that people really just need to tap into by going to the younger generations, older generations, speaking with everyone, having their experiences, learning their perspectives, and then implementing that into some sort of design policy. Whether it be architects, planners, every stakeholders, get different perspectives in, and I think you'll get a very, very fruitful and creative solution to a lot of the issues we talked about.
Great, thanks, Amy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me the issue will come back down to the planning of the city at a local level. And I think city planners need to be able to respond to the ideas from local businesses, and possibly adopt them in relation to what's best for the city, as opposed to the accumulated vested interests from different parties. And so I do think that city planners, there needs to be a certain independence from them. I also think, I mean, Amy mentioned the Galway Arts Festival, the John Gerard piece. I do think there needs to be more art and more, I suppose, aesthetic experiences throughout the year, as opposed to just a small concentration. Because I think these experiences do open up spaces and allow us to think about them in different ways. And the box was a very good example, because when it was there for a month, the minute it was gone, you felt that it was missing from that space, as opposed to before it was never there. So I do think more projects like that, maybe street art, and more, I suppose, cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary activities from different stakeholders, and trying to build a better, more creative city, you know. And I think that's I mean, I think design is probably a good word to try and bring everything together, because we had a monthly event in Tartare called Wine and Design. And while it initially began pairing a winemaker with a designer, we ended up, when you broaden the idea of a designer, you actually bring in like people who cook, people who draw, people who tattooists, people who write. I mean, that element of design. So I do think that if we can think of design in a very expanded way, then I think we can make the city a more habitable space.
Great, really interesting. Yeah, so architectural pavilions here. So I think that's really interesting. So, you know, really bringing in art and thinking of events in the city in new ways for engaging, changing mindsets around what we can use public space for is a crucial thing going forward. So we've come to 9:30 now. So I just want to say a huge thank you to our two panelists, Amy McKeown and JP McMahon, and also to Frank here for all his work in organising architecture at the Edge. So thank you, guys. I'll do a little clap myself. So I'm not sure, Frank, do you want to say a word, or will we close from there? You're all good?
I think we're all good. Thanks very much. You did a great job, Mary, and I thought it was a really interesting discussion, and I had lots of food for thought actually about potential for what we can do in the public realm, with food and events and all sorts of things. I think it's
I think, as Amy mentioned, I mean, asking young people, but I think certainly maybe we should ask more 8-year-olds what they need in the city. I think that we never think about the creative potential. I mean, I have a daughter who's 8, but seeing the city with those eyes, I think sometimes can open up spaces in really interesting ways. And I think sometimes as adults we're very programmed and stuck in our own ways.
Yeah. No, I think it really hitting it when, you know, there's a lot of criticism of these youths gathering around the city, but give them something to do, give them something to look at that looks quite cool, give them some food, you know. And let them have a good time, you know, but obviously in a safe way. But there are ways to do it. I think that's what I got from this discussion. Thanks anyway. We're out of time.
Great. Yeah, and everybody, of course, check out the rest of the conference or the program for the events for tomorrow and Sunday.
Brilliant.
Okay, take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.